Good morning. Today we'll be looking at the remote learning lecture on Chapter 1. The first thing we'll discuss in Chapter 1 will be the structural organization of the body. When we're looking at the structural organization of body, it includes the chemical, cellular, tissue, organ system, and then finally the organismal level of organization. The first two components that we're going to look at today are going to be the chemical level. With the chemical level, we're first looking at the atom, which is the smallest unit of matter. When we combine two or more atoms together, such as a sugar or a water, it becomes a molecule. And more complex molecules, such as proteins or DNA, are called macromolecules. These macromolecules are going to form organelles found within the cell, such as the rough endoplasmic reticulum or ribosomes. After that, we're moving on to the cellular level. And within the cellular level, it consists of cells, which are the smallest living structures and serve as the basic units of structure and function in organisms. This structure allows for specializations needed for different functions. For example, when we group a bunch of muscular cells, skeletal muscle cells together, their organized protein filaments allow for muscular contraction. Moving on to the next level, we're going into the tissue level. Tissues are precise organizations of similar cells that form specialized functions. The four types of tissues that are found in the human body are epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissues. When we group similar tissues with similar functions together, we move into the organ level. These different tissue types combine to form an organ. Organs usually contain two or more tissue types that work together to form complex functions. When we then move into the organ system level consists of related organs working together to coordinate activities and achieve a common function. For example, in this picture we see the accessory organs of the liver and the stomach and the gallbladder, and the primary organs of the large intestine and the small intestine of the digestive system. And finally, when we group all these organ systems together, we see an organismal level, which is the highest level of structural organization in the body. All body systems function interdependently in living humans or organisms. So before discussing the different types of systems that we have in the human body, the first thing that we should be discussing is the characteristics of all living things. These properties are very common to the majority of organisms. First, there should be organization, such as complex structure and function. There should be metabolism, such as chemical reactions when we see exchanging nutrients such as digestion, gases and respiratory system, or even the waste as seen in the urinary system. Third, there should be growth and development. We should see an increased size or growth and an increase in specialization, which is considered to be development. For example, the growth of the brain through adolescence and the specialization or the development of higher levels of thinking and speaking. Fourth, we should see responsiveness, sense and respond to change in internal or external environment, such as a reflex reaction, such as a hand touching a hot plate. Fifth, we should see adaptation, alter anatomic structures, physiological processes, and behavior traits. An example of this would be darkening of the skin pigmentation with high levels of exposure to the sun. 6, regulation. Usually regulation is considered to be defined as homeostasis, and homeostasis is usually considered to be referred to as a range, sometimes called a steady state. For example, a blood pH of the blood can be anywhere between 7.25 and 7.35. And finally, the last characteristic of all living things is number 7, reproduction. New cells for growth, repair, maintenance through the life cycle of the human. So when we look at organ systems, the first one we'll take a look at is going to be the integumentary, otherwise known as the skin. Its main job is to provide protection. It helps regulate body temperature. It's the site of cutaneous receptors, such as the hair on your arms. It synthesizes vitamin D and prevents water loss. Some of the primary components of the integumentary system are the hair, the skin, and any of the associated glands, such as your sweat glands. The next one we'll look at is the skeletal system. Its main function is to provide support and protection. It's the site of hemopoiesis, which is blood cell production. It stores calcium and phosphorus and also provides muscle attachment sites. When we look at the skeletal system in detail, we'll see different types of bone structures, such as long bones, short bones of the wrist, irregular bones, such as the vertebrae. The next system is the muscular system. Its main job is the production of heat during body movement, and it also allows for contraction, which is an accessory for locomotion. And again, when we look at the muscular system, we'll see different types of muscles in the human body, whether it be bipinnate, unipinnate type of muscles. The next system that we'll look at is the nervous system. The nervous system is a regulatory system that controls body movement. Its main job is the response to sensory stimuli. And third, it's responsible for consciousness, intelligence, and memory, especially in the central nervous system. When we look at the nervous system, it's usually divided into 2 categories: the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system and all of its accessory parts. The next one is the endocrine system. Its main job is consisting of glands that secrete hormones. These hormones are important for regulation of cellular growth, differentiate chemical levels in the body, and also aid in reproductive functions. Some of the primary glands that we see, or some of the primary structures that we see in the endocrine system, are the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, the adrenals, the pancreas, and the kidney. Next is the cardiovascular system. It consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and including the blood. It's responsible for delivery and removal of waste products, hormones, and nutrients. The next system that we'll look at is the lymphatic system. In the lymphatic system, its main job is to transport and filters lymph, which is a byproduct of blood transportation. It also initiates an immune response when necessary. Some of the primary structures that we see for protection in the lymphatic system are found in the tonsils. We also see different regions of lymph nodes, which aid in the immune system response. The spleen, which helps filters the blood. The thoracic duct, which is a series of lymphatic nodules located in the sternum of the human body. We also see these located in the inguinal area, the popliteal area, and it's transporting lymph through the structures called a lymph vessel. The respiratory system is responsible for exchange of gases, oxygen primarily, and carbon dioxide between the blood and air in the lungs. Some of the conducting or some of the delivery structures would be the nasal cavity, then the nose, portions of the pharynx and the larynx. And the pharynx is actually shared in the digestive system also. The trachea, and then we see the respiratory component of the lungs, which aid in transportation of CO2 and oxygen in the bronchi, the lungs, and the skeletal muscle of the diaphragm in the thoracic cavity. The digestive system, its main job is mechanically and chemically digests food materials, absorbs nutrients, and expels waste products. Mechanically, we see the structures such as the oral cavity or the mouth, including the teeth, the salivary glands, and the pharynx for helping to mechanically break down. And then chemically, we see chemicals being secreted within the stomach, large intestine, and the small intestine for distribution of nutrients and expelling of waste products after digestion is completed. Next would be the urinary system. With the urinary system, its main job is to filter the blood and remove waste products, and it does this by expelling urine from the body. The main structures that we see in the urinary system would be the kidney, the delivery mechanism of the ureter, storing in the urinary bladder, and released through the urethra. Then we have two separate reproductive systems. The first male reproductive system produces the male sex cells, or otherwise known as sperm, and it also produces the male hormone called testosterone. Some of the structures that are important in the male reproductive system would be the ductus deferens, the prostate gland, urethra, the testes, the scrotum, the penis, the epididymis, and the seminal vesicles. In the female reproductive system, it produces female sex cells called oocytes. It also produces the female hormones estrogen and progesterone, and it's also important in the development of the embryo and the fetus. The structures that are important in the female reproductive system include the mammary glands, the ovary, the uterus, the uterine tubules or the tube, the vagina, and the external genitalia of the clitoris and the labia. When we get into the language of anatomy, the first thing we should talk about is the anatomical position. This individual is standing in the correct anatomical position. The individual is standing upright with feet parallel and flat to the floor. The head is level and the eyes are forward, so we don't see the chin dropping or raising, so we see everything in parallel. The arms are to the side, the palms are facing forward, and the thumbs are pointing out or laterally away from the body. When we see correct anatomical position, we can then break the body up into sections or planes. The first one would be the coronal plane, located here. The coronal plane divides the anterior from the posterior sections of the body or divisions of the body. The transverse plane, located here. This transverse plane is important because it divides the superior versus the posterior divisions of the human body. And finally, the mid-sagittal plane, which runs right down the center of the body. This mid-sagittal plane is important because it divides the right and the left halves of the body. When we get into the body cavities, we're also going to be discussing the body cavities and the membranes. The first body cavity that we'll look at is going to be the posterior aspect. It is going, first of all, it's going to have the cranial cavity. With the cranial cavity, it houses the brain. This cavity also goes by the name of the endocranium, and it does not have a serous membrane, which we'll discuss here in a second. The vertebral canal is formed by the individual bones of the vertebral column and the spinal cord. It also does not have a serous membrane. When we look at the ventral view of, or the ventral cavity, the first thing that we're going to do is divide it into two simple areas. We're going to be looking at the thoracic cavity, which is the superior thoracic cavity here, and including the diaphragm. And then we're also going to be looking at the abdominal pelvic cavity, which includes two structures, the abdominal cavity and also the pelvic cavity. Both the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity are lined with a thin serous membrane. These membranes secrete serous fluid within a serous cavity. Serous fluid is typically consisting of oil serving as a lubricant, and it helps reduce the friction during any type of organ movement. There are three different areas that we see with a serous membrane. There's a parietal layer, a visceral layer, and a serous cavity, which we'll discuss in detail. And finally, in the thoracic cavity, we also see the structure of the mediastinum, which contains the area of the heart, thymus, esophagus, trachea, and the blood vessels. This area also does not have a serous membrane. So when we're discussing the differences of a serous membrane, which are going to produce serous fluid to help for lubrication and reducing friction, there's going to be usually a parietal layer, which usually lines the internal surface of the body wall. There's going to be a visceral layer, which covers external surfaces of the organs or the viscera. And then usually in between that is going to be some form of a space. For instance, when we look at the pleural cavity, we can see that there's a cavity space, or what a serous cavity basically means is between the parietal and visceral layer of the serous membrane. It's usually a potential space or an area which is able to become larger if necessary. So when we look at this view, what we're going to first look at is going to be the parietal pericardium. So the parietal pericardium is the outermost layer and forms the sac around the heart. The visceral pericardium forms the heart's external surface. And in between these two, what we see is the pericardial cavity, which the pericardial cavity is the space in between the two, and it contains the serous fluid. We also see this makeup with the lungs. So inside of the lungs, we see first that there's a parietal pleura, which lines the inner surface of the thoracic wall. We see the visceral pleura, which covers the external surface of the lung. And in between those two layers, we would have the pleural cavity, which contains the serous fluid, which allows for lubrication during movement of respiration. We also see this setup when we're looking at the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is what we're going to be particularly looking at. It's most of the organs of the digestive system, kidneys, and the ureters of the urinary system. The pelvic cavity is kind of located down here. The pelvic cavity is located inferior to the superior ridge of your hip bones. So the top of your hip bones, just directly below that, is what we consider to be the pelvic cavity. For this illustration, we're going to be looking at the peritoneum. The peritoneum is the serous membrane of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The peritoneum, again, is a two-layered serous membrane that lines the entire surface of the pelvic cavity. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at the abdominal pelvic cavity as a whole. So when we're looking at the parietal peritoneum, we're looking at the outer layer of the serous membrane. It lines the internal walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity. It also has the visceral peritoneum, and this visceral peritoneum is the inner layer of the serous membrane. It lines the external surfaces of all the digestive organs located inside the abdominal pelvic cavity, such as the small intestine, the large intestine, the stomach, etc. There is a potential space in between. It's called a peritoneal cavity. This potential space between the parietal and visceral peritoneum is called the peritoneal cavity. And again, it contains the serous fluid, which is important for lubrication. That concludes Chapter 1 Remote Learning Lecture. Thank you.